Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Signal 11 Outdoors podcast. Tonight, I have a very good guest and a friend of mine, and I think we're in for a really interesting conversation. How are you, Freddie Frisco?
I'm doing great, Steve. Thanks for having me.
Oh man, this is awesome. I'm going to bring up real quick. I've known Freddie for quite a few years now on a level that's interesting because we haven't really. It's not like we're together a lot, but we talk a lot, and I've known Freddie probably since around. I think I met Freddie around. I met you around '09, Freddie at the Jets. From there, it's kind of been a really interesting relationship, so to speak, because with Facebook these days, you feel like you really know people really well, but with you, I do know you pretty well because we talk a lot and you've helped me out a lot along the way. So today we're going to talk to you, Freddie, about a whole bunch of things. But I mean, you've been hunting for many years and are still active. I think the topic is going to really be talking about hunting today versus when you started and how you got into it and the changes you've seen and what parts of the business and hunting itself that you got involved in. So if you don't mind, Freddie, just start us off. I ask a lot of people how they got into hunting, roughly what year, and let's get started with that.
Well, a young kid growing up in North Bergen, New Jersey, I was fortunate to have a father that felt even at a young age. He born in northern Italy. They do a lot of hunting, a lot of fishing there. So once he had his sons, he figured, he'd get them going. My older brother, it never took off, but with me, it took off 6, 7 years old. I started shooting a bow and arrow in the school I went to. They had someone that was interested in archery, and I took it up then. And 3 years later, at 10, I went through New Jersey and was granted a license at 10 years old, which allowed me at the time. The seasons are a lot different than they are now. I believe archery season was maybe 2 weeks back then, and there were maybe 100 applications, so it didn't take off at all. So I started about 10 years old, and we had access to quite a bit of property. My father did. So
Interesting. So what year,
he
Freddie?
that was 1956. Things were
Okay.
very different then. The equipment was limited, but 70 years later, the equipment is, people would think it's better, but I could do everything I did when I was 10 as I could now. To me, it was all about what I learned early on, arrow placement, and make sure you take the right shot, especially for the sake of the animal. So my father had access to some property, even living in North Bergen, and right around Round Valley, where Round Valley Reservoir is. It wasn't a reservoir then, it was just a lot of empty farms. And he dropped me off at about 7 a.m. He had a lot of faith in me at 10 years old to do the right thing in the woods because I already had 3 years under me. He dropped me off by a tree and he said, I'll come back in a couple hours. And he came back in a couple hours and no cell phones, of course. So I was a little late, and I think he was a little worried that I hadn't come back. But I did come back, and he was happy to see me. He said, "Well, how'd you make out? Like, did you see anything?" I said, "Yeah, I shot a doe." And he goes, "You shot a doe?" Back then, if you got one deer every 2 years, you did well. And sure enough, I did. And today would be like winning a lottery. So he field dressed it for me, and that was the last time anyone ever did that. And just bragged about me like I just graduated from college and with a doctorate. So that really propelled me into being just even better than I was then, standing on the ground and all that happened. And so he took care of everything. He got the deer out of the woods, and back then they did things differently than they do now. They just hang them outside. They hung them outdoors for most of the time. That day, the next day, maybe a couple days later, and let them dry out. Today, as I know, the animals, it's much better. You're much better off skinning them and letting the meat dry out that way. But we ended up getting the deer back and brought it to the butcher and all that, and it was a hell of a way to start out at 10 years old. And now at 79, the only year I didn't harvest a deer with the bow was when I was 14. So I've taken on this sport, and even now at 79, I'm in a tree maybe 150 times a season. I don't miss an evening. I hang a portable up there, and the amazing thing that I see is the age gap of hunting 69 years. The excitement hasn't dropped one iota. I get up in a tree, I got the shakes, I see a buck coming in, and maybe I should carry an AED with me at my age because it still gets to you, the sport, and it never goes away, and I always think it is, but it doesn't. So that got me into everything after that, and I was probably about 18 to 20 when the bow changed a little. There were a few more recurves to buy. My first bow was a Kodiak Bear recurve, and it was a hell of a job pulling that bow. What they call it stacked. As you pull the string back, it was harder and harder. So you never knew your fundamentals of trying to hold it back. It was very difficult to hold the bow. But so you more snap shoot, which I talked a lot about Fred Bear later in life about snap shooting. I copied his, and he was a lefty. So I copied his just the way he did everything, and kind of really got me into a better shot. Because when you shoot instinctively at using with no sights or anything like that, you really that's the heart of hunting to me more than anything else. When you do it like the Indians did, and often people don't want to take on that challenge. But if you think of it logically, it's you take a basketball player, he's 50, 60 feet out, he turns around and he swishes this tiny ball into a hoop. And it's all about mechanics and repeating the same form every time. It could get in your way in a way, because if you're from your tree stand and you watch a big buck come in, you start focusing on the horns. So generally where you focus, you'll hit. So it becomes a something that you develop, and I never really did get rid of my Brackenberry and some of the bows I had, and I don't use them all the time, but I will take them out and still use them today, and it's I still get more of a thrill out of that way than even using a compound, which I got into later. I'd like to talk a little about, bypass some of these years and taking me in my early 20s when I believe was the first compound that came out, and it was a place called Summit Archery in Jersey City, and the owner was Walter Arduini. He had a basement. If you look, used to go down his basement, he was making shafts and risers. He was an aluminum genius, and he had parts all over the place. And I believe he had the first compound, and it not the compound we have today, but very similar. It was 24 inches, and it worked on 6 wheels, 3 on top and 3 on the bottom. So the weight was transferred that way. So it was, I'm going to say 50 pounds, maybe drop you to 45, but it was still a lot better than what we were doing. So that was the first compound I've seen, and they were more and more developed after that, which to where we are today. We still didn't have sights back then. So it was still a lot of instinct, and the first sight used that I'm aware of was a matchstick that you taped on the riser. So the head of a matchstick can cover a deer at 10 yards. So you still had to work from everything I taught. When you draw a bow back, you start from the bottom below the animal up. I'll argue with anyone that differs with that. Maybe not today with some of the bows I use, but still in all, because when you start seeing fur, you have an incline to snap that arrow back, and that generally gives you a high hit, which looks good. It runs away, but you never ever retrieve an animal like that. So, and also during that time, I saw we started seeing more elevated platforms that we built, and the platforms were then changed to little, maybe 2 by 3 pieces of plywood with a some sort of a wedge on the bottom, and it leaned against a tree, and there were metal spikes from the back of the stand that went into and a come along, and everything kind of started working its way out. Back then, you didn't really use harnesses either, so you really had to, you almost had to be lucky at times. So watching all those things happen, and at the same time, you saw the first sights come out. The first sights in the late 50s, early 60s were circles, and you screw that into your riser. Of course, back then you had to tap a hole into your bow, which today you wouldn't think of. But and they came in a series of 4 circles, and at 15 yards they were precisely made that the circle would 15 yards, the largest circle would fit exactly in the circumference of a deer. So as you got back further, the circles got smaller, so you were capable of shooting between 15 and 45 yards. Some people said that's crazy, you can't hit anything back then, but I've been to some tournaments where you'll have someone flinging a recurve 80 yards and be within 3 inches with a dozen shots. So that's not really true. It just takes a lot of work to get there. Today you pick up a bow, you have a lot of moving parts to it and a lot of things that have been added to it, which weren't available back then. Later on, we started getting a kisser button, so you knew you can keep your mechanics there. We made peep sights, so you could measure the difference between your eye and your lip, and you would fundamentally keep those mechanics perfectly. If you could do that with a golf club, you'd probably be, a pro in no time. But it kind of helped things, and releases they weren't born yet. A release wasn't born, which to me was one of the biggest things, the release with the loop that you clipped onto, because when you draw a string back, the torque always you had a lot of pressure on it. And if your mechanics weren't perfect, you wouldn't ever have an opportunity to really harvest an animal unless it was luck. And my book said, if you don't have a perfect shot, you don't take it. And if you take it, that'll be, the last time I'd hunt with you. So watching things develop, everything during those years, there were a couple of years in between that things would change. They started advancing pins more, where you had a pin rather than that. But still the pin was good for X amount of yards. So you had to still get into the distance, which is the biggest problem. When my son was young, he had 3 pins, and I put 3 markers on the ground. And he was 10, and he functioned well as a 10-year-old because he stayed within those till he learned about things. Back then, you didn't have any rangefinders, but they started to come out then in the 70s, I believe. And the rangefinder was a little different than today, where you click and you know right where you are. You had to have 2 dots fall into the same dot, and that would give you your distance. So it was more of a lot of work to do your distance. So I started teaching when you get out into the woods, make sure you pick 3 or 4, the areas where they're coming and pick yourself a spot. Oh, that tree is 32 yards. That tree is. So it kind of helped, but still, after all that, you see the big rat coming in, you forget everything I just taught you anyway.
Right.
So, someone asked me, well, what is the biggest change you've seen in archery? And the changes are very, very slow that came along. It was a conglomerate of some of the things I just mentioned that made archery, it improved the sport and made it, gave the animal, you had to give the animal the opportunity to, harvest it cleanly, or it's not just the way you want to do anything, some people
Right.
think it's almost like a gun, but it isn't. It's a bow and arrow, and after 69 years, I've seen everything. Uh, there was a lot more teaching, especially early on with William Wadsworth, about the angles. It was impregnated in my head, and every course that we gave, which was in the Northeast, we talked about angles. William, the father of bow hunting, probably was the most, including Fred Bear, he was probably the king of anyone I ever met. He made me better, even though I thought I was good already. But as we moved on into archery, the things started change, which we thought was good. You had people were worried about speed and the speed of the arrow. They were trying to hit 300 feet, 280, and we all had instruments that we can measure the speed of our arrow. So we went lighter. When we went lighter, an arrow went quicker, but the foot pounds, it didn't carry through to what was the right thing for the animal. I mean, animals were being hit and the penetration wasn't there, but the speed was. And what made that even worse were the arrow heads that opened up. Why use a head that opens up when you can use one that's already open? And that was really a big thing, because in the early years you had a bear head and you had a hillbilly. They were very similar, and I still use them today on a recurve. I harvested an elk with a recurve with a bear head that was made 30 years ago. So the heads didn't change. So opening heads, I think, was a big thing for speed, but it didn't help archery. And I think a lot of archers did finally see that, especially when you went from a deer who was 100 pounds to an 800-pound elk. They weren't even going to be bothered by something like that.
Right.
And it's funny, like how a lot of the archery and the new stuff was made was pretty, but a lot of it wasn't as effective as the various compounds that came out. They were very hard to keep tuned. They would always go off, and you were shooting accurate back then. More target, you would use lighter arrows. Archery, people wanted to use lighter arrows. They wanted to use heads that were between 80 and 100 grains, and arrows that had a certain spine. So I think Pete Shepley from PSC, who I met and I hunted with quite a few times in New Mexico, Colorado, he did something that I feel today, if someone said, what was the biggest thing that they did in archery as far as the things that were made to accompany your trip? You had to carry other things. There were other things that you had to do to make sure, because if you're in a tree stand, then something can go wrong with an animal coming in, and I'm sure you can attest to this. It will. Murphy's Law is in everybody's tree stand.
True.
So some of the archery people that made archery products, they added what they called a shelf. So behind the riser, there was an extension of 4 inches, which brought the arrow rested back there. So now you went to a shorter arrow with good spine, but you cut 25% of the weight off. That worked. That was pretty. That went into a lot of archery equipment, and I think Pete Shepley from PSC was the father of that. He took the bow, he took the quiver, he took the sights, and he made his bow to fit all these various components. And I think that was one of the biggest things I've seen, how you can take another arrow out. And I believe he had some of the better, where an arrow with fletchings, made sure that the odd fletching passed through the middle of all your sights and everything part of the bow. The rest, there was a lot of clearance there. And archery just kept moving up, but I think it took the biggest run from the 60s to the 70s. And then the run, it went up 80% there, and then it will go up 1% every year. A lot of things worked, a lot of things didn't work. But it was all the same fundamental what you were doing. And now, of course, we're into, the compounds aren't, I still use a compound. I use a regular bow. I don't use a crossbow. I do think it's a great sport, and it's just another sport in a way, almost like a shotgun and a muzzle loader. They're different sports, and you still want to do them. But I'm not sure if archery can move up a lot further from here. There's one thing that I asked for possibility, even all the manufacturers. If you can make a bow that you draw at 20 pounds and releases at 60, that's the deal, instead of the opposite way. So again, but thinking about 70 years of this, it doesn't change. It's the same thing, the animal in the same direction. I believe the whitetail is the smartest animal in the world, including elk. I've spent 30 years hunting them too, and something about a whitetail, when they're even I think they're born with the eyes and the ears to know when there's something going on, and that makes the hunter react. But that's a quick assessment of watching archery grow over 70 years. I don't know many people who have seen archery grow like I have, and have been around the right people and the right teachers, and have seen equipment change, and I've been asked to try it many times. And even the different manufacturers. There's one manufacturer that I think I admire even more than Pete Shepley, and Matthew McPherson. McPherson made a recurve, and later on, he didn't do well. He didn't make any money. But when he brought out his first name, the Matthews bow, he did something that no one agreed with. No one thought it would sell. He used a single cam. So he used a cam on one side and a round wheel on the other. When you use two cams, there was a lot of fine tuning to do. You'd have 3 or 4 good shots, and all of a sudden you'd have 3 or 4 bad shots. You had to adjust 2 cams. He decided to use 1 cam, and I wouldn't even use the bow. But I ended up speaking to him and a couple of people that used them, and wow, I think that really took a lot of the error out of a compound, if not all of it. That might be one of the, I keep mentioning the biggest thing as I go along and think of my age and what I've done. A lot of things have changed, but I think that was a huge change in archery equipment. And it really hasn't changed a lot. Plus, I believe he was the first one to use a loop where the arrow was nocked, which took a lot of that bending back and forth. But as I know, he failed early on and then moved into the single cam, but he stuck with it. He said, it works, it works, it works. It didn't change the speed. So that's really, I thought that was a big, and I'll use any bow, any one I pick up, but I still use Matthews. I kind of feel he was a good guy, a great guy to talk to back then. I don't know if you can get to talk to an archery CEO now, but I kind of knew him more back then as the bow went from, I think maybe the teaching I was doing had a lot to do with them even wanting to talk to me about it.
Right.
But I look at 70 years of this, and it blows my mind that I can't wait to get in the tree again. You know?
Well, I have to say, Freddie, it's everything you just said there. I mean, everybody's going to be captivated by it. That's into archery, whether they're young, old, or whatever.
You're a little
Because
blurry to me now.
it's okay. It'll still come out clear. You're
Okay.
good. What's interesting though is, and I have to say this, over the years that I've known you, we've had a lot of little conversations, some long conversations, and knowing everything you just said there, I kind of picked up over the years how involved you were at levels that most people are not don't ever have an opportunity to be as involved as you were with the whole archery industry and the people you've met and the things you were involved in helping develop, which was really cool. This is one of the reasons why I wanted to get you on here and let you kind of talk. And we're just beginning, so everybody's in for a treat. But it's so interesting to hear. I couldn't even, me being 57 years old and only archery hunting about 20 years, I couldn't even ask you the questions about the things you just talked about because I didn't even know some
Right.
of those things.
Yes.
And I'm sure there's so much more. There's a lot of guys that have hunted as many years as you, but I think you were much more in depth with the equipment, the advancements, the train. You trained people, and also this is really great stuff. But before we even move to anything else, since we're talking about archery equipment and the beginning days to where and how it developed, I know you've met Fred Bear. Can you just touch on that a little bit and how you guys met or when you met and what you got out of it? Just because he's basically the father of bow hunting, and
Yes.
obviously maybe not the only guy, but if you could touch on that, I'd appreciate
Yes.
it.
Fred Bear, I read his book, and after you get to know him or speak to him a couple times, you can see he goes hunting in his book, and he goes for 4 months, and he goes from state to state to area, and he eats what he gets. He's a pretty interesting guy. In person, just a lovely gentleman to talk to. But in the 60s and early 70s, you started seeing shows like you appear and represent your products. Harrisburg had the biggest one. I believe the second time I met him, it was in Harrisburg. But the first time he was in a little, very small, somewhere. It was in northern New York, and he was appearing in an area where, and in that area is a lot more hunting than there is now, less bow hunting. So he was there talking about. He was at a small show. And the show had some bows and it had arrows and things he made in his heads. And I went up there and grabbed his ear and he liked talking to me because I think we were on the same wavelength for where we were and where we are now and where we want to be. And he was a very low-key guy, and he's probably the only one of Fred Bear and myself were in the back seat of the car, and someone in the front seat was asking questions, I'd have to muzzle them. He just loved to talk about archery and how everything he did and why, and he was so fond of teaching. I think later in life, people may have tried to take advantage of him with money and changing bows, which he had no desire to use a compound or anything they were starting to talk back then or anything that was on wheels. I think later, I think if he lived another 10 or 15 years, he may have. He may be stubborn like me, I go to a compound, but that's about all. And when I can't use that, I'll know, you know. Uh,
Yes.
but to talk to him and not even realize he was really not anything back then. He had a bow, he had blades, he had didn't have a lot of money. He was a real woods guy and didn't care about a whole other thing. And the thing I liked about him is about 4 or 5 years later, I met him again, and he remembered my name and remembered our conversations. He said, I always remember that conversation that you and I had. And I said, and I think I remembered you too because your name's Fred. But I said, I started shooting like you do. Went a little more at an angle with that recurve because you're in a recurve. Those are 58 inches. Those are 5 foot bows. Some of the stick bows were taller than I was. And, you're not going to get into a tree or a blind. And I could just imagine the mess that would make. He taught me shooting 3 fingers under where the arrow was not, rather than 1 over and 2 under. And he taught me, and it's funny, I was a good recurve shooter, but I became so much better after talking to him. I could sense what he was trying to tell me, almost like shooting anything. Sometimes the bee doesn't have to go there. It's just your eye and your mechanics that knows where you're locked in and what happens. I've harvested quite a few deer that even though I had a sight on there, I didn't use it. And none of my friends could. They couldn't do that. They couldn't fathom. Oh, I got to find a peep sight. I got to find this. I don't have to do that even today. Just too many years of that. But he loved his head, and I asked him about he had a Hilbrey made a pointed head. I said, why did you make yours a little flat on the top? He started making them flat. So it didn't have a point. It was a little jagged across. And he said, with the right shot, you'll get more, there'll be more, potentially less of possibility of an exit, but there'll be a greater blood trail for you to be able to find the animal. So he didn't try to do too many things too different. And 50 years later, I still would use his head because it still works. It works better. A 2-bladed head generally will fly better years ago than a 3-bladed head. Now it's just the opposite. Now you have so much speed behind it. The feathers are different today. They're not as long and they're not as, I don't think, fluffy as some of the plastic we're using. But it didn't go out of tune back then either. And don't forget, you shot off a riser. So one of the feathers hit a piece of felt. So they had to fold up quickly. But just knowing him and reading his book, and I said, yeah, that's the guy I talked to. I could have talked to him all day, just about things. Today, I wish I could sit next to him, and knowing him, he'd remember our conversation because he's one of the few that taught me really got me into a new zone with it. Some of the other people I've been thankful to meet over the years are some of the early innovators of some of your clothes, like the tree bark.
Right.
It was the first camo. Because you couldn't have camo. My son was 10 and there wasn't any camo for kids. There weren't bows for kids. And the first bow made for a kid, I don't know the manufacturer. I Googled it. I tried to come up with it. But the riser was in the center. Now when you see the risers on the left side, the shelf, or it's on the right side. One's made for a lefty, one's made for a righty. This was in the middle, which was unbelievable to see. And it made it easy for a kid. So my son had one, and he was 40 pounds, and the bow was 40. But from shooting since he was 6, he had no problem with that. And that was an interesting concept. back then, as my mind has taken me 70 years while I'm speaking with you, but I'm loving every minute of it. Uh, I love to talk about this so much. I've been in a car with some of the athletes for 4 or 5 hours heading up North State or towards Canada, and I don't stop talking about it because like you just alluded to, and sometimes I don't even realize, but I have been around 70 years and took a love for everything that was done, and so many changes they try to make. A lot worked, a lot different work, and
Right.
right now, I think things are at a standstill in some way with archery. I mean, you have especially with some of the speed and things like that, but still, it's that education of what comes that which what was starting to develop back then. A lot of it was tree stands and steps that we had to use. The steps back then were way different than they are today. There weren't ladder steps. There were climbing stands, which became an issue as you started teaching people because once you start going up something, you have that's when you can have your problems. Someone falls, someone slips, someone grabs a rung the wrong way, and that's where a lot of problems happen. I unfortunately did see some people fly out of tree stands over the years, but I can go.
Um, as you're talking about, one last thing I want to ask you about old stuff versus new stuff. I actually had a question for you real quickly. Difference between no camo or whatever you wore back in the beginning to now, and then I'm going to jump into some other questions I have for you.
Yeah. Well, back then they didn't make camo. You had army fatigues, so there wasn't any production in it. And I spoke to all the archery manufacturers, and said, "Why don't you start getting into clothes?" There weren't kids that were hunting back then. It's now you take your children. I think it's done a lot more now than then. So I bought a pair of army fatigues, and I cut it open. I cut them open, and my son was 60 pounds. So we went to the tailor, and we made him camo because he had to have camo like his father. And that young man hunted and ended up being a Marine out of high school for 8 years, so he used camo then too.
Yeah.
But the clothes started to become, and to me, I feel you can elk hunt with a Sunday suit on, but deer they don't see distinct colors, so they notice a lot of movement and things like that. And sometimes we overthink what we have to wear.
Right.
Of course, we all wear camo, and a lot of camo back then started, it was tree bark and it was nothing else but more or less military camo. Then the evening things started coming out. Various camos came out. Snow camo came out, different colors. I forget who made the snow camo, but to me that was big because you sat near a snowy tree and you were part of the tree.
Right.
But camo, it was more money making than I think that was related to the effectiveness of it. So
Gotcha.
a mask potentially, yes. But we started getting all the gimmicks that were being sold, and I was part of the gimmicks. And everyone knew hunting is part of the gimmicks. I don't ever felt that if I had a gray suit on with a blue tie would have changed the difference. If I had camo on, it's all about movement.
Right.
Especially
Right.
elevation. It's all about movement. Once they see movement, they know there's some issues going on there. So we
Right.
started hunting higher. We started hunting in portables and getting up to over 20 feet or so, and that worked for a while. But after a while, all of the young fawns were born with their heads up. So they came into the woods and actually looking, which kind of makes it good in a way, gives them a good chance. But
Yes.
the clothes to me are they're nice to wear, but in my opinion of seeing hunting without it and with it. But my son was 10 years old. he had to have Camo like his father. And as a 10-year-old, he was in the woods so early, like my father took me. He was a very good hunter at 10.
Right.
And at 10, he harvested a deer with a bow, harvested one with a shotgun, and harvested one with a muzzleloader.
Nice.
And he was all of 60 pounds. So, you can kind of make, not that you can, make your son a great baseball player if you're one or a golfer, but, he started taking, and you have a son, I still
Yes.
go with my son. We're going to Alaska next month. He's going to be 50. And
Right.
we spent 4 days there salmon and halibut fishing, and we still hunt together. So it never goes away. And I have 3 grandboys that I've taken. So you take the sport and, treat it like a sport. I always tell people, don't, none of us need meat, but we certainly enjoy it and have friends that like it. So we take things there. But to get back to archery, I don't know if I've seen any big change in the last 10 years that say, oh, I'm going to go for that. Again, we have to be more careful with speed and make sure we have foot pounds. Back then, we would have the 280 feet per second arrow, and it would stick in a hunting arrow, would stick in a half-inch piece of plywood at 20 yards at maybe a half inch. If you double the weight of the arrow, so you aim a little higher or you set your pin a little different, you'd literally go through that. So maybe not as much as the whitetail, but a lot of people, when I teach, make sure the angle's right, or, you can have a problem. There's a lot of bone in these animals. So, as far as anything else about archery, I mean, I've kind of taken you through the wing. We can go into muzzle loaders, which have huge changes too.
Yes, I think what we're going to do is I'm going to boy, there's so many different topics we could talk about. But what I think I want to segue into, if you don't mind, I want to mention again. I mentioned it briefly in the beginning. I'm going to bring up just how I met you through the Jets and what your involvement was there as far as the hunting aspect of it. Because for people who don't, a lot of people that are watching this have no idea who you are. But I think after watching the first, we did about 40 minutes already. They realize why I have you on here, because you're a wealth of knowledge with archery. But I just want to tell people there's a lot to Freddie Frisco that we're not even going to cover on a podcast. But this I do want to cover, if you're okay with it, Freddie. I met Freddie, and I said this. I met you working at the Jets, and you pulled in with a cooler on your passenger seat. I didn't know who you were. I was driving Mr. Johnson around a little bit, and then once I met you, I asked Mr. Johnson about you. He told me who you were, and then the next time I saw you in that cooler, I found out I think there was venison in there and venison jerky. So just if you don't mind, give us, just for people, because I think it's interesting, no matter what you're into, it's going to be interesting to hear a little bit about you and how you got involved with the players, and whether it be NFL and NHL players, whatever, how you basically got them into hunting, and I know even fishing. And I know you've done a lot, because I used to look at all the photos of you with all the players on the fluke trips or the fishing trips, and the hunting pictures are awesome stuff. That's kind of what led me to Freddie Frisco, was me being into hunting, working there, and meeting you, knowing you were taking these players out to hunting for Mr. Johnson. If you don't mind, can you just touch on that a little bit for us?
Sure. I was hunting a piece of property in Bedminster, and part of the acreage was owned by some of the Johnson family, the Robert Wood Johnson family. And the farm I was hunting on was owned privately by someone else. And in some time, right before Mr. Johnson bought the Jets, maybe a couple years before, maybe 4 or 5 years before. So we're probably going back 40 years right now, hunting on a property, and the owner told me he sold the property. And this owner wanted to make sure he had the correct number of males and females. He was so into the keeping this land going for prime bucks and things like that, and he loved a little meat himself. So I was hunting with one other person on this 600-acre property for quite a few years. Then he said he sold the property, and he sold it to Robert Wood IV, Woody Johnson. So there was some conversation that went between the past owner and Woody Johnson. So when he became full owner, we had a conversation, and Woody Johnson is a hunter. He likes hunting. He asked me if I would stay on. Really, stay on hunting? Yeah, I think so. Yeah. And the seasons were different back then. You could take as many animals as you want, archery. The second season, you would buy a tag and take your 2 animals, and they would give you 2 more tags. I'm glad that's gone in a way. But anyway, he mentioned to me he likes venison, and he likes turkey, and he likes all that stuff. And I heard a lot about you, so I said I'll definitely, continue keeping the animals the right amount where they are, food supplies and things like that. So he ended up buying about 1,100 acres there. And the rest of the Johnson family owned about 4,000 or 5,000 acres. So they owned pretty much the town. So I began hunting there, and he learned that I was into safety more than anything else. And he asked me to record what I shot and stuff like that, and had stuff given to him. And he just loved all of that. So all of a sudden, he decides to see a couple jet hats around. And I'm going, what's going on? The past owner is selling them, and, be nice if he bought them. So it was nice because he bought the jets, and I was sitting wherever I wanted to, and he took real good care of me. But after 2 or 3 years, he said, Fred, I'd like to get some of the players involved. So every year in football, and being a Jet fan from '60s, I was so excited about that to start meeting players. So each year they would discuss in-house who wants to hunt, these are the seasons, this is the guy, this is what goes on. And we would figure out, you had a lot of guys from Texas, you had people that were somewhat hunters. So I said, definitely we'll take this on. What we would do is have them all the state come in. And we would have to learn the different weapons, and I wanted to get them certified through the state. If you're not certified, then, like you're a fireman, you need to be certified. And this is just as, serious as anything. So I wanted to make sure that they were certified. So I can go to, Mr. Johnson, look, these guys are all certified, they're this, they're that. So he would always ask me, okay, what do you think of this? And it was hard to tell you, just meet a player, and to me you had 350-pound children that, need to be, so we would fine tune 5 or 6, sometimes 8 or 10 of these players. I'd meet them on a farm. We go through with the state. We go through the various weapons. We go through this. We'd have a written test, and they all got through, and they were all certified. Even though the Texas boys they kind of, when they come here, they just think they just know everything about hunting till they meet Fred. And then I quietly, I would look through the class, and no one would get let loose alone. Because I know that if I do this for 50 years and there's one accident, only one, I'll be a bad guy. So I started, and I found out more of the quarterbacks. We had the offensive line the first year, and we had the quarterbacks. Quarterbacks, I met them all. They all hunted. I don't want to say they're smarter, but I may, between you and I, say they were a little better bow hunters in a lot of ways, Yeah. I don't know, maybe a little more athletic. So every year I would probably have 10 good students and then make time for all of them. So I more or less hung up my equipment and I found out what other people do, what teaching is. I've been around this so many years. This is just more fun teaching and watching what they get out of it. And today, I have friends from 20 years. We talk all the time. I have so many, like Mark Brunel and somebody, we were tight as could be. So to Woody Johnson, it became, now they have something to do. You know, their days off, they have something to do. and it keeps them here. I know before Brett Favre came here, Woody had him around his whole farm with his helicopter. Yeah, look at that, you know, and then Brett's going, oh yeah, I'm playing here. And that was a big reason why he came here, you know. He could throw the ball in any state. But I learned when I had a young kid, 10, I learned a lot. And I said, you know, he used to come in the tree when I was 8, and he'd start getting, just sitting with, he'd start getting fidgety. So I learned that a new player, whether he's, you know, 20, 30, and no matter where their experience was, they don't have a long time frame without seeing anything. They're not going to sit up there like you or I with 3 or 4 hours and say, yeah, we had a good day. They have to see animals. So back then, I would plant food plots in specific locations where I knew the entrance and the exit for them would work well and where animals came from. So I had specific, maybe 15, 20 different areas where I could take any given player, you know, he could make a little noise going in, it wouldn't make a difference, and they would see animals. So my goal was to have them have action every night here. And I'd have to say, out of thousands and thousands of hunts, I'm not saying it's bragging, but there was 99% when they had action. So everyone loved me. You know, I just had a lot of land access. You can't do this on small property, but you can do it on 3 or 4 miles of it. Then it became, okay, everything you learned, trigger guards, the safety was so big to me. I can't stress it. And now you get, some of the players wanted to hunt in elevation. So we had, we ordered about 20 16 to 18 foot ladder stands that held 400 pounds. So I started putting them in strategic areas. And I had another athlete, Scott Stevens. He was amazing because I had met him at that point, and due to Woody Johnson wanted me to take this Canadian guy hunting. Little did he know he was a Ranger fan, and I didn't want him to come, but he turned out to be one of the greatest guys I've ever met in my whole lifetime.
I agree.
I've never seen a guy pick up a full together 18-foot steel tree stand, pick it up, and walk it to the tree himself. And then I'd have confidence, he would have made a good fireman, have confidence that once it was tied up, it would work fine. But I would create the atmosphere for these guys where the tree, the stand was nestled right, everything was going right. And still, you know, I always told them, treat that step you're going up every time for the rest of your life like it's going to break. Don't ever go up, you know, free fall, and harness in when you get up there. But now you had a lot of weight up there, and you had people. Some I wouldn't put in a tree stand. But what I did around these tree stands, I planted crops, and I planted an entrance how they could come in. So I didn't want anything to go, oh, this isn't a good spot. I never heard that. If I bring it in, it's a good spot. I think I spoiled my son that way, but you know, these players got spoiled. They were seeing trophies and I mean, the first time I took Brett Favre in the woods, he harvested, you know, he took a couple deer. I mean, he was the gunslinger for a reason, but he was excellent at what he did. But he couldn't believe that every time I took him out, I said, you're going to get pissed off someday if you come in and you don't see anything. He goes, yeah, I am. But I spoiled them. I spoiled everybody because I know when they came on that farm, they forgot about football, they forgot about everything, and they couldn't wait to see me. And they were always good to me, all the guys. Then I had the few that the biggest issue was getting the bow up and down out of the tree. You know, when to do it, how to do it. And there's only a few that I didn't have to watch, but I had to watch quite a few of them, especially the ones that I sat on a blind with, or a tent, whatever you wanted to call it back then, because, you know, keep away from the finger guard, the trigger guard. Don't pick that gun up till, all the things that you learn. It's loaded, even if it isn't, on and on and on. All of a sudden, you see that big rack come by, and everything I taught them, they forgot. Literally where, someone's picked a gun up and shot the top of the tent off. So someone does something like that, I kind of don't have to really be careful about how I treat them and what I say to them. I don't want to start screaming at them, even though I did. But again, that person gets one-on-one with me, and I'm telling them what to do when a deer's coming in. Get your hand out of the trigger. I kind of get it into their head on what they should do correctly. And the man upstairs was always with me because thousands of instances and hundreds of deer that we harvested, we never had one incident. And like I said, if we had one, but that was my goal. You can't make a mistake. In my life, I studied immunology and transfusion medicine. A mistake was death, and it would have been like this too. So it was really nice just seeing them succeed, and seeing people like Sanchez and Kellen Clemens, hugging it made me so happy to see the success in their eyes more than anything I could do. So every year we took a group of players, and whoever kind of looked like they really wanted to do it, and we taught them, and we trained them on weapons. And muzzle loaders, I always went out with the person, or I had a guide go out, because muzzle loader to me can get you in a lot of trouble, especially the next bullet if it doesn't go off. Too many moving parts of that. I didn't even like when they muzzle loaded, to tell you the truth. But we had some really incredible hunters, maybe 250 over the years, and I probably keep up with 100 of them because they remembered everything I did. But Woody Johnson loved it because that's all he did was talk about it. Then I'd bring it to the butcher, and I'd have actually the checking station came to us on the farm because we had so many high-profile players. I didn't want to. I didn't want them to get bothered for autographs and things like that. Right. So we.
That's interesting.
But I have thousands of stories about these players, and some of the more unique ones were turkey.
Yeah.
We had an excellent farm for turkey. We had it taped quite a few days and filmed. Had to watch who I took there. But I took the guys I know they could do all that when the turkey's coming in. I'd set up a little blind. I'd call, and the gobbler would come in, and you'd see this high-profile athlete turn into like a 6-year-old, like he just got out of the candy store, and just see the joy and happiness it brings to them. So we would, again, have that butchered for them. I'd have the butcher and the pride. Sometimes during our doe season, I bring 1,000 pounds of meat that was butchered and taken care of and processed, and a lot. Mr. Johnson always wanted it to give to homeless and the vets, so we gave a lot there too. But it went on for about 35, 38 years. This
very cool.
Yeah, and you meet a lot of people on that farm.
Oh, I'm sure.
But it became what I love to do more. I love talking about this because I can't talk about what happened in the 50s.
Right.
And, but when you hear the story, you were hunting your whole life, you can think, boy, look where this did come. this sport. Climbing a tree was an issue, making sure and get the right proper weight, making sure they went up and down correctly, and making sure they buckled in.
Yeah.
A guy like Brett Favre would climb up 30 feet through the limbs and think if he fell, he'd be fine. You know, some these players some of them are so high profile. They've been great their whole life. They come there and they just think this is going to be easy. But I said, by the end of the season, I know you're from Texas. You're gonna, I remember Cody Spencer saying, boy, I did this, I did all that. But boy, he's my best friend still. He said, boy, I can't believe you Yankee, what you taught me, So then I would have fishing charters. I'm a licensed captain for almost 50 years now. And so, again, I have a lot of respect for the woods and more respect for the water. So I arrange fishing charters.
Yeah.
And there's so many memories of that where they came out for striped bass and bluefish and things like that. And to this day, they still do. So I change a lot of lives, and that like Fred Bear changed mine. I kind of give some of that back, and now that kids hunt, they're sending me pictures of them and stuff like that. So I love it. I love teaching.
Yeah, I just want to reiterate on something. I mean, I'm friendly with Scott, with Scott Stevens, and obviously I've talked to Brett, and they've told me so many good things about what they got out of meeting you and the
Yeah.
hunting and fishing and stuff. But the one thing I just want to mention again is the Jets have a lounge back there in the training facility in Florham Park, and there's a lounge in there with all. I can't explain it all, but a beautiful lounge and barber shop and all. But that back wall has all of those pictures. I'm not sure if it's still like this today, but the back wall next to Dave Zott's office had all the photos of the outdoor adventures with you, Freddie.
Yes.
And when I would look at that and I would see the different players, and like you mentioned, you might have a D lineman and a quarterback on the same team in a photo together on a boat fishing. To me, those were I'd have a cup of coffee and I would just stand there and look at those pictures. And it was just a different view of these players in a different moment in their life. And it was really because of what Woody allowed you to do to bring those players together for a moment or a couple moments that were just an escape. And I really love those photos. I don't think anybody's ever going to see them. I'm
Yes.
sure you probably took most of them, but I was lucky enough to look at them. And as a hunting and a fisherman and outdoors guy, I looked at those and go, this is what people need to see.
Yes.
These are the players in the purest form of enjoyment. So I appreciate everything, Freddie. I think we're going to wrap it up. We've been over an hour. Unless there's anything you really want to add, I could see you and I getting together and doing this again in the
Oh,
future.
definitely. Definitely.
Yeah.
We can go into muzzle loaders and things like that change. Knowing Tony Knight, who had the first inline, and how I work with him on it, and some of the lighted pins, and a lot of little things that came out that I was blessed to meet some of the innovators of everything we do. And I'll tell you what, a shout out for Signal 11.
No, thank you. Appreciate it. I
Okay,
appreciate
Steve. It was wonderful. I really enjoyed what I did, and anytime again, my friend.
Yes, I think we're gonna have a part 2 with Freddie Frisco. It might be the first double part of
Anytime.
and we'll do it at a different time because you and I will talk. And there's so much great information that you have there. And
Yes.
again, people have no idea you're involved in so much more than just hunting and fishing.
I'd love to,
But
Steve.
yeah, we're going to get together again. Freddie, let me just thank you so much for coming on. Really appreciate it. You've been a real help to me personally through my business, and as my business evolved, I bounced a lot of things off you, and you always came through with great advice. And we're definitely gonna do this again because I think as much as I enjoyed it, there's a lot of people I was listening to you going, I got to get a link out to this guy and this guy and this guy, and even a woman that I know that hunts. They have to listen to Freddie talk about the evolution of archery because you have so much in your head that you've experienced and you're willing to share with us. So,
Great. Thanks a lot, Steve. Take care,
all right,
brother.
Freddie, giving you a goodbye, and we're going to definitely do this again. Thank you.
You got it. Take care, brother.
Take care. At this time, we'd like to thank our supporters and sponsors. Signal 11 Lures, Lip Glue, New Jersey Multi-Species Podcast, Sever Broadheads, Jersey Fluke Bellies, Favorite Fishing Rods, Timberlife Outdoors, and Buck Knives. If you enjoy the content on our podcast, please like and subscribe and turn on notifications. And please tune back in for our next episode. Thank you.